Okay.
No, but do I introduce him? Yeah. Exciting. I'm so pumped.
I keep resisting. I keep resisting. I'm doing this with my phone now.
Just wait. Just you wait.
Yeah. I'll talk about an hour. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's begin.
All right, welcome everyone. It is very good to be here and in person after so many years. We had a bit of hiatus at the IDC. I'm going to just stand back and be safe. We had a long hiatus because of COVID. We started the Indigenous Design Collaborative's speaker series about 2 years ago with Ted Hohola at the University of New Mexico, and it sort of stopped after that when COVID hit. So I'm really happy to be back in action, to having conversations and bringing people together and talking about ideas. I am so excited about having Chris here tonight. We have people on Zoom as well tuning in safely from their homes. But what really is so exciting to me is that we've been studying Chris's diagrams for about 5 years at the IDC. A lot of the students are here that graduated from the program who study Indigenous design. And as you know, it's such a complex, holistic worldview, and trying to silo it into categories is very, very difficult. We're always trying to organize it and order it to make sense of it. And Chris came about 5 years ago. I saw some diagrams that he did to try and describe it. And it just sort of set us all on a pathway to how we organize our thoughts thinking about Indigenous design. Since then, I've been following his work really closely, and we got the chance to go to Venice Biennale together as a group of 18 Indigenous architects in 2018. Chris was part of that show, along with many others from across Turtle Island. So we got to know each other there. And we just found out that he is now moving to the Southwest, which I'm very, very excited about. He is now the new chair of the architecture program at UNM. So with that, let me read a little bit more, a formal introduction. Chris is a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin and now the chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of New Mexico. So happy. He is the founding principal of Studio Indigenous, a design practice serving Indigenous clients. He was the collaborating designer with Antoine Pradoc on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. He's the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the inaugural Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbius, a 2008 Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award, and an artist residency from the National Museum of the American Indian. Chris has been exhibited widely, including the 2018 Venice Biennale. Cornelius, he was also the spring 2021 Louis Kahn Visiting Professor at Yale University. Studio Indigenous received a 2021 Architects Newspaper Best of Practice Award. So, with that, let me welcome Chris Cornelius to the stage.
Thank you, Wanda. Wat kuf nuela du, Chris Nyongets, Aquahoni Wagitu Loda, Okale, Oneta Aga, Nuagadon Choda. So I said in Oneida that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I'm Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. Very happy to be here. This is, I think, my first in-person lecture in over 1.5 years. So I'm not lecturing in my office when my dog is hearing me. He could probably recite the lecture at this point. Very happy to be here. And I'm also very happy about my new job. I started on November 1st. I'm very happy to be an administrator in architecture. I've, over the past few years, talked a lot about architectural curriculum. I'll talk a little bit about it tonight and my thoughts about it. But I got to the point where I was like, well, if I really want to do something about this, I should step into leadership and do that. So I'm very happy to do that, and very happy to be down here in the Southwest as well, as a place that I think can be very receptive to that message. So this evening, I'll talk about basically three themes in my work. And the first theme is design is ceremony. And what I'll preface this with is how I've learned about architecture. I saw nothing indigenous in my 4 years of undergrad and my 2 years of grad school. I had to seek those things out. And so the entire time I was receiving this education, I was always thinking about how do I apply this to the ways that I'm thinking about design for Indigenous people. And so when we see this image, we all, I'm sure, have seen it in architecture school, the duck in a decorated shed. So for me, it was a way of beginning to think about how buildings were being made and designed for Indigenous people at the end of the 20th century. It's still happening a little bit. So this is this elementary school that's on my reservation. It's not the school that I attended. This was built in the 90s, but it's a turtle. The school is shaped like a turtle. The gym is in the head. The kindergarten is in the tail. And so they talk about that. But once you're inside the building, it loses its turtleness. The turtle is not experiential. It's not necessarily telling you anything about the culture once you're inside. So there are a number of buildings like this. There are a number of turtle-like buildings, bear paws, thunderbirds, those kinds of things. And I call them the zoomorphs, right? The zoomorphic buildings that look like animals that are important to Indigenous people. The second is what I'll call the pictograph, which is a normal building that has Indigenous iconography applied to it. And so I believe that in both of these cases, the architecture is not indigenized, right? It's not, doesn't become Indigenous architecture by applying these sort of methodologies, because I don't believe that there's any kind of cookbook or formula to think about Indigenous design. I also don't think it's a type or a style, it's a way of thinking. And all 18 of us that were in the Venice Biennale, I bet if you asked us the same question, we'd give you different answers about what Indigenous design actually is. However, we share a similar worldview, and we share a common sort of cultural basis for doing the work that we do. The other thing that I'm interested in as a designer is the notion that Indigenous people have always named places in very specific ways. And so when we look at a place like this, it's called Bear's Ears. I won't try to pronounce it in those languages, but those 4 languages basically translate into that, right? And there's a story that goes along with the form that you see in the landscape. This happens all the time. It doesn't matter where you are in the US or Canada, these things have these names. And sometimes they're based on animals, but what you realize is that the stories themselves are not just embedded with a kind of entertainment or mythology. They're actually embedded with science, technology, history, anthropology. Those stories are there to tell us a lot about the particular place and the fact that how you should respect the landscape and how you should think about it. So these are the things that drive me as a designer. Like, can I make architecture do the same thing? Can we have architecture that we can tell stories about in a similar way? And so that it's not just a sort of surface thing, right? Like you see the turtle and then once you see it, it's over. But how do we begin to experience that thing and at various scales as well? So the idea or notion that design is ceremony, I think of it as such, because I think about the responsibilities I have as a designer. When I'm putting physical things into the world, I have responsibility for doing that, right? And that ceremony is guided by a series of rituals, and I see design as rituals. I think we would think about design quite differently if we thought of it in that regard, as opposed to a task or a thing that we're trying to complete, right? The idea that we are putting things into the world with responsibility, the materials we select, who's making those materials, who's installing those materials, where will they be in 50 years, 100 years? Am I making a thing that's going to end up in the landfill in 50 years? Or am I making a thing that is here to be sustained and have maintenance and begin to tell its own stories? And so that's the way that I try to think about ceremony. So when I was asked to be a part of the design team with Antoine Predock for the Indian Community School in 2003, he was selected through an invited competition. The school asked them to have an Indigenous designer on the team. They selected me to do that. At the time, I was actually in Virginia. I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia. I was practicing there, and then that's when I established my own practices when I was asked to do this project. It is a K-4 through 8 private school. Students only have to prove Native ancestry to attend the school. There's no tuition. It's an endowed school. They purchased around 200 acres just southwest of Milwaukee, and they teach the culture and languages there. So the school was started in the late 60s by 3 mothers who were unhappy with how Indigenous history and culture were being taught in public schools. They pulled their students out of public school and they started their own school. And they went to various locations until they started this school and the campus near Franklin, Wisconsin. It's on a wooded site. It was formerly a farm. There's wetlands, there's forest, there's all kinds of landscape features on the site. And so one of the things we wanted to do with the project was to I would say uncomplicate the relationship between Indigenous people and education. That's a nice way of putting it, right? That education has always been a tool for assimilation and colonization. But I see education as a thing for a device of emancipation, right? If we could begin to think about it differently. So what we tried to do is to strip all of the institutional things from it. So for instance, the place that they eat, we have never ever called the cafeteria. We've never called it the cafeteria. The place that you come into the building is not called the lobby, it's called community. The theater is drum. We stripped all of those institutional names. And those are the things that we can do as designers, is to get people to think about the spaces that they're using differently, right? That the idea that these sort of institutional names don't need to be propagated and they don't need to be part of the everyday life of the school. This is the student entrance. It's called migration. It's a ritual that happens every day in the morning and then in the afternoon. Big hubbub if you've ever been at any school, right? The biggest sort of events are when students are coming into the school and when students are coming out of the school. This is the second story. The second story is about the sky. We have these tree columns that were harvested from the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, just northwest of where I grew up in Oneida near Green Bay. If you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, you can see where the Menominee Nation is. It's that dark rectangle in the sort of just slightly northwest of Green Bay, the bay from the peninsula. It looks like a Photoshop or a glitch of some sort, but it's actually how it looks. The Menominee have always sustainably harvested their forest. They have always had stringent sort of policies and using how trees are harvested and replanted. Those trees that came for our columns, they were brought down in a ceremony. They gave their lives to the school. Many of them are over 300 years old and they hold stories. They hold stories of pre-European contact. They're put in the school to tell those stories. The bark was stripped from them by an Indigenous artisan and he kind of split them and put them around the steel columns and they're part of the life of the school. And so I like to think about things as a series of reciprocities, right? So when we're creating things and designing buildings, and I think the same is true for cities, other sort of contexts. It's not just a sort of rural context that we think about these things. These things are living. And when we put a building into it, we're adding to that. And we ought to be cognizant of the things that we might affect. So I created this graphic that is from the site all the way to the moon and just below the surface of the earth. So examining all of the things that burrow into the earth, the scale at which they burrow into the earth, what lessons can I learn from my non-human relatives? What can we learn about building in this sort of in particular climate in Wisconsin where our frost line is about 4 feet deep. So the first 4 feet will freeze during the wintertime. Animals know enough to burrow below that, right? They know to keep warm within the earth. Starting to look at birds, butterflies, things that migrate across the sky, at what levels they're migrating, geese that are migrating at 20,000 feet, airline traffic that's crossing the site, where our weather actually is within that sort of atmosphere. And this graphic actually changes vertical scale as we go up, where space travel happens all the way up to the moon. To understand that the very thing that I'm putting on the ground is going to affect all of that. And understanding that that is a relationship now that I've entered into. It's kind of a covenant and an understanding that I've entered into with that site. And so we created cultural, we call them laminates. But the one thing that this graphic I'm trying to convey is the idea of relationality in indigeneity, meaning that we talk about things as if we're literally related to them, right? The earth is our mother, the sky is our father, stones are our grandfathers, the moon is my grandmother. These are very important things because we believe that to be true, and we should be treating those things as if they're true, right? I'm not going to disrespect my mother. I'm not going to disrespect my father. I want to be in a good relationship with them, right? And I believe if we thought of climate change as a way of us to be able to reconcile ourselves with that relationship, we are in an estranged relationship with the earth. And we ought to be able to think about how do we make those relationships better, right? How do we start to engage those relationships better? I think that architecture can do that. I think if we started to think about buildings as if we were related to them, we would begin to think about that quite differently. So we've also seen this in our architecture curriculums, right? The Logier's frontispiece about the origins of architecture, right? The architect is pointing at this. This is architecture, but I think it says a very important thing about nature and the role of nature in architecture. In this case, it's as if nature is a raw material to be possessed, right? And that this is the thing that I've accomplished. And so I oppose that with what indigenous architecture is. It's intended to blend in with nature. It's intended to be in relationship with nature. It's intended to not see it just as a resource, but see it as a gift. And that gift is a reciprocal thing that I intend to have that reciprocity for life and begin to think about that. So in this case, nature is a commodity we have dominion over, right? I recently had this great discussion with Bruce Mao, the graphic designer, and he said like one of the worst things that was ever written in the human sort of understanding of writing was in Genesis when it says that humans have dominion over everything, right? That's not the case, right? We're in relationship with everything. We don't have necessarily just dominion over it. But again, the idea that it's a relationship, if we thought about our buildings as if we were related to them, again, we would think about that very differently. And so the differences in the relationships of nature is, in this one, nature is mine to possess, mine to have dominion over, and nature is me. I'm a part of this thing. And so I'm a part of it as a designer, as a maker, as an inhabitant, as a professor, as a student, like whatever my relationship or role is in the world, I have a relationship with architecture. We have thought about architecture as buildings and as inanimate things, I think, for far too long. And if we started to think about them differently, we would think about those responsibilities. In indigeneity, we often talk about plants as being our oldest relatives. They are the things that they've seen drought, they've seen hard times, they've seen winters, they've seen summers, good growing seasons, bad growing seasons. There are lessons for us to be learned from those relatives. I believe that buildings are our youngest relatives. They're babies, right? We put them into the world. I'm the parent of this building. This thing poops, it creates waste, it sweats, it breeds. It does all of the things a baby does. And so I need to think about my sort of role as the parent of that thing when I'm putting it into the world and when I'm giving it to my clients, right? Like what is that relationship with my clients? And they specifically told us as designers, we want a 100-year building. In 100 years, this building still needs to be here. And that guided all of our decisions in that regard. But it's not something that we have talked about in indigeneity. Building and architecture have always been a part of our culture, but we haven't like sort of specialized that or taken it out or compartmentalized it in any way. It's always been part of our rituals, part of our inhabiting, part of the ways that we see the world. Just like this religion and politics, economy, all of that was a part of our culture. And my discipline is architecture. And so I want to specifically talk about that, right? I want to specifically think about that. And I see buildings as the 21st century artifacts of the culture. I'm not trying to change the culture and the worldviews that I have and have grown up with that are embedded in my DNA. But as a designer, I want to make contemporary things. I want to make things that are projecting into the future. And I agree with Douglas Cardinal when he says our elders' teachings are not about the past, they're actually about the future. And if we saw them as that, then we would begin to think about them quite differently. So in my work, there was a period of time where I didn't have a lot of commissioned work. It was called a recession. But I was making things, I started to really think about, what if I started to make things that had less of perhaps my sort of voice and heavy-handedness as a designer? Could I make things that tapped into the storytelling that's in my culture? Things that were, could I begin to think about an architecture that might be made by animals, might be made by humans, might be made by something else? It might be made by something that I don't even know what it is. But how could I begin to do that and to begin to think about something that perhaps had a sort of tacit understanding of nature, one that I didn't understand? So I decided that I was making these physical models. Sometimes they started with drawing, sometimes they didn't. And I made the distinct decision to not use people as the scale figures, but to use animals. And so we're not quite sure, and I'm not sure as the designer of this, maker of this thing, whether this deer is looking at this thing because it made it, because it doesn't know what it is, or it's anything in between, doesn't care, right? I'm not making those decisions. And I decided to do that because I feel like as architects, sometimes we try to make too many decisions about the thing before it becomes a thing, right? And so what I'm trying to do, and I try to teach my students too, to think about using all of the other cognitive parts of our brains, and especially in our representation. And I mean physical models, I mean digital models, I mean hand drawings, I mean renderings, right? Like, how can we begin to use different cognitive parts of our brain? How can we begin to start making work that is more about asking profound questions than it is about making distinct answers, right? And maybe we might get it wrong, but what is the consequence of it? The stakes, whether we realize it or not, in school, the stakes are pretty low. No one's getting sued. You might get a bad grade or something, right? But we're as instructors, I see myself as one that help students facilitate those answers, right? Like, how can we start to ask those questions? And so sometimes it starts in my sketchbook, and one I was just like interested in cladding like an eagle's feather. And so that's all I needed to do, right? Then I start building this physical model. I tend to give myself, this is just my own sort of personal thing, but I tend to give myself parameters. I wanted to make these plaster landscapes. I wanted to use found boxes as sites because we're given sites. Oftentimes we can't change it, right? We can't change the size of it. We can't change its history. All of those things are part of the ways of making these things. And so later on, this started to inform the installation work that I was doing. I was asked to build installations at a time I really wasn't looking for that, but it did happen. This is actually the second installation. I'll show you the first in a second, but it's a temporary installation. It was a children's literature garden in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee. And so when I wrote, it was an artist residency. When I wrote the proposal, I wrote about the role of the trickster in Indigenous storytelling. And the trickster is there to teach us about our own humanity, usually, our own sort of vices, our own sort of greed, our own sort of vanity. And so in the story, the trickster does something, and then you see the consequences of what they did. And instead of the stories telling you, don't do this, don't play with fire, don't mess with wolves, be nice to each other, it tells you a lesson. And whether you get that lesson or not is up to you as the individual. And so I tried to make a thing that I wanted to intentionally defy form and program. Like, it wasn't a pavilion. It doesn't look like a thing. I'm not trying to make it look like an indigenous form. I made it out of trees that are harvested on the site, and I created this copper mesh cladding for it. I wanted it to kind of look like an animal. I kind of wanted it to make it look like a thing. Did it just crawl here and it landed? It doesn't move if I turn away, or is it standing still? And it has regalia on it as well. I started to think about the idea of regalia in Indigenous culture because it's not, I call it hyper ornament, because it's not just aesthetic and it's not just ornamental. It tells you about where someone comes from, things they may have accomplished. So on the right is a Gustoe. It's the headdress of my people, the Haudenosaunee, and we're a confederacy of tribes. And so we all wear the same headdress, but the feather configuration on the top tells me which nation this person is from. This person is from Mohawk because it's 3 feathers up. I'm Oneida, so I would have 2 feathers up and 1 feather down. The fact that it has antlers tells me that it's a chief. Our chiefs have always been elected, but we wear this similar sort of headdress. And so can architecture begin to do that, right? Can we add ornament or aesthetic to creating possibilities for things? Also, I believe that in the things that we might call ornament or decoration or whatever we want to call it in architecture, could they be habitats? Could we start to actually make buildings that become habitats? We spend a lot of energy keeping birds off of our buildings. Is this really where we should be spending our energy? What if buildings were habitats for migratory birds? What if buildings were habitats for pollinators? We know that buildings are the second leading killer of birds, and other than natural predators. Can we make things that think about our non-human relatives in that way? And so when I was making these models, the one on the left, this installation is kind of loosely based on it. And it's actually made out of the same exact copper mesh that I made that model out of. I was thinking about that idea of regalia and putting it onto the piece. This is a film of the piece that friends of mine made in the winter of 2019. My friends from Spirit of Space made the film. They make films for Stephen Hall and Jeannie Gang, and they're actually UWM alums and been friends of mine for a while. And they sent me an email one day, said, Chris, we want to film this thing in the winter. I said, go ahead, go for it. I don't tell them how to film it, but I love how they revealed things to me about the piece that I hadn't thought about before. And part of adding the regalia, I wasn't thinking about the pine needles, to be honest. I wasn't thinking about that at all. And I like how they kept their distance from the thing, as if they got too close to it, they might scare it away. They are excellent storytellers when it comes to making films about architecture. I made a second trickster. This one was for a fellowship that I won, the Knoll Fellowship for artists in the Milwaukee area. I won one for established artists, and part of that was to do this group exhibition. So I got to make one in a museum. And so for me, the trickster itself is a vehicle for me to speak through, right? It becomes a character for me to be able to talk about. And that's the interesting thing, or there's many interesting things about the tricksters for me that are in Indigenous culture, but there are ways for us to be able to tell lessons, right? They're kind of like a human invention. And they're there to tell us, again, these lessons. And so this one is very proud about being in this exhibition. Again, it's made from trees. It gets the biggest space in the gallery. I'm thinking about things like when I made this model of how it meets the top and the wires that go around it. It has these antlers. Is that part of it? Is it a trophy that the trickster won? Or is it a trophy that the trickster is trying to make you think that it won? And how I put the copper mesh on it. When I started doing this, at least on the first one and the second one, I had this notion, like I felt like I was making a shirt for a giant bear. I was like folding the thing over. I didn't want to see the fasteners. The copper mesh itself, I work in various ways to get the patina the way that I like it. But when I'm making the thing, I now have a material dialogue with that thing, right? And so that material dialogue is Indigenous ontology. It is like I am putting indigeneity into the thing because of the relationship that I have with the piece. Even the way that I put these trees up, when I lifted them off the ground and put them into the air, they started to tell me where they wanted to go because they became very heavy and I had to like configure them in a very specific way. So we were like dancing, and for a few seconds, the trees were leading and I had to like get into the right position in order to put these things up. I love that sort of dialogue. That's the beauty of making the installations, is I have this sort of immediate response with the things. And I'm trying to create a dialogue between what I do as drawings, what I'm making as models, and what I'm making as physical artifacts. How can I now pull this into the scale of full buildings? How can I begin to have these same sort of conversations? The trickster also allows me to say things that might be irreverent or are truthful, right? And so the previous trickster won the Architects Newspaper Best of the Design Award for Best Temporary Installation in 2018. And I wrote this thing that you have to write a thing that's like 250 words or something like that, right? So I wrote the description. This is what it is. This is what it's made out of. This is its purpose, whatever. And then I said, tricksters on stolen land. Trickster never forgets. Trickster always wants you to remember. They somehow didn't publish that part of it when they published the awards. But again, the trickster never forgets. So I'm always going to speak about these things in this. So in this particular case, this gallery has a second floor, second level. And so when you go up to the second level, you could see this tag. And I just put the tag at the top. I just wanted there to be some kind of payoff for going upstairs and viewing the thing. But I want to continue this sort of dialogue in making these tricksters. The first installation I did was for the Miller Prize. I was one of 10 designers asked to compete on 5 sites in 2016. This is the first iteration of Exhibit Columbus. And it was basically a head-to-head competition. We were assigned the sites. I was given First Christian Church by Elio Saarinen and his son, Eero Saarinen. This is like the first modernist church in the U.S. If you don't know the story of Columbus, Indiana, it's just an amazing place. It's really quite extraordinary. They have several Eero Saarinen buildings. One of IMP's first buildings is across the street from this. It's the public library. They had a program where they hired famous architects to design public buildings, and it's Cummins Diesel that's headquartered there that funds that sort of program. This wasn't actually part of that program, but it kind of kicked it off. And so you can see this was built in 1942. And I was given that site. But what I wanted to do with the project was call attention to the people that were indigenous to that part of Indiana, the Miami or Miamia. And they were wigwam sort of builders, right? Like a lot of Great Lakes sort of region indigenous people. The wigwam is saplings that are bent over into this dome shape, and then they're clad with reed mats or bark. I think that they're highly technological. If you start to examine the structure, they resist thrust when you put them into the ground. They have a hole at the top so that you can have a fire within it and smoke doesn't fill the thing. In this case, you can imagine the winters that these things have to survive. But the cladding of it too, and the artwork of the Miami, which is this image on the right, the ribbon cutting. When I talk about and think about indigenous art, we should think about it as a way of understanding how people see nature and their relationship to it. And so it doesn't always stand for a thing or a very specific thing, right? It can sometimes, but usually often it doesn't, meaning the ways that the ribbons are cut is a very specific sort of ritual that they do. It's almost like a moire pattern where it's multiple patterns that are cut over, but it can reflect things like an eagle's feathers or a set of fish scales or other sorts of things that you see in nature. And so I'm thinking about these kinds of things when I make this particular piece, because when you start to examine things like an eagle's feathers, right? The feathers on the neck are very small so that they can have agility in their head, and then the tail are very big. These things have to fly with very high speeds and high precision, highly performative. What lessons can we learn from that for architecture, right? What are the lessons that we can begin to learn that the performance, the aesthetic, all of those things are part of or one thing, basically. So this is the piece that's called Wikiami, which is the Miami word for wigwam. I am intentionally trying not to duplicate those forms. I'm trying to intentionally not make it look like a wigwam, right? For a number of reasons, and the biggest sort of reasons are, well, they would expect an indigenous architect to make it look like that, right? Like people often ask me, like, why did you make it out of steel? Like, I'm supposed to make it out of sticks. I'm supposed to make everything out of sticks because I'm indigenous or something like that. I'm trying to resist those urges, and I'm trying to resist those things. I believe that indigenous people, this is my belief, are the people that are most subject to stereotype. And that stereotyping comes from a lack of understanding, a lack of teaching our history, a lack of understanding that we're still doing these things, right? We're still cutting these ribbons, we're still making these baskets, we're still beating these things, we're still doing these rituals that have been done for tens of thousands of years in the same landscapes. what I want is to be able to raise awareness of that. And so the pieces themselves, as they stand as a physical land acknowledgement for people to understand to the people that were there first, and that those people had a very distinct relationship with the landscape, and what are the lessons that we can learn from that, right? And so this is a history that was erased very quickly in Indiana, which ironically has the name Indiana, Indian in it, right? Which because it's the land of Indians. And then that history was erased. And so the piece for me was a way for people to understand and be able to kind of raise the awareness of people that were there. And so I read Elio Saarinen wrote a lot in his relationship. He wrote about the relationship to nature. And so when I started to think about the siting of this thing, I thought about this canopy. There's a very dense tree canopy. There's a small cavity in the corner and how the thing inhabits that. I set it up so that there is, for me at least, there is a relationship between my piece and the Saarinen Tower. The tower there is really an extraordinary thing. It's a landmark, to say the least. I don't know that there are many structural engineers that would let you do that today. Because of its like slenderness to height ratio, but it's really extraordinary. And so for me, I wanted these things to be in dialogue with one another. I didn't want to frame the conversation that they might have, but to set up the forum for that to happen, because we weren't asked to respond to the pieces, but I felt like this thing it's in a way, it's almost genuflecting towards it. Like we're praying to the God of architecture here, and I'm doing the same thing. And Indigenous people can do that too. It's oriented towards the sun in the fall equinox, so that through the top and the door, the most light would come into the piece. I have always seen it as an animal. It sleeps at night. It doesn't have lighting on it. People use it in whatever way they want to. It was there for almost 2 years. So it was originally part of a 3-month exhibition. So in 2019, they ran the second iteration of Exhibit Columbus, and they opened the third iteration this past August. So they're a new set of Miller Prize winners every other year in Columbus. So I'm very, very happy to be part of that history. The second theme I want to share is drawing as medicine. The idea that, and this is part of one of the rituals of the design, right? For me, when I'm thinking about drawing as medicine, oftentimes you'll hear Indigenous people talk about beading as medicine or basket making as medicine, that it's the actual making of the thing that makes me feel better, makes me think better, and makes me design in ways that I'm thinking about that greater responsibility that I have. So projects almost always start in my sketchbook. In 2003, I decided to not erase anything. I haven't erased anything in my sketchbook really ever. I believe that we draw how we think, meaning ideas might not be so concrete when we start. They might be kind of vague, so we draw kind of lightly. If those ideas aren't going in the direction that we thought they were going, we can draw over them. And that's basically what I do. I don't like turn the page to a new blank thing. I don't erase anything. I just keep drawing over them. They have a sort of layered sort of truth within them because of that, right? I kind of feel like the drawing should look like you worked on them. I fill about 2 of these sketchbooks a year. And so sometimes I just start drawing. People would call it doodling, but it's a thing. Like it's like priming the pump, right? Priming the well. You have to start pumping in order for water to come out, because we can sit and look at a blank page forever, right? And I think as designers, we can think ourselves into a million problems. And I believe that we can draw ourselves out of any problem, because inspiration will find you working. The ways that you think and design, those things will come. And I think there's a kind of misconception in the ways that we've been designing and teaching design and teaching representation, meaning that we've thought about the design in our minds, and now we're going to represent it, right? Like now we're gonna sketch it. Now I'm going to make a 3D model of it. Now I'm going to make plans, sections, elevations of it. And now I'm going to make a scale model of it. And then I'm going to make construction drawings, and then I'm going to make a building, right? Like it's a very linear process. But in reality, I think in the early stages of the drawing or making of the thing, that representation should be a reciprocity, that the representation itself can begin to tell us things about how we're thinking as designers. And so I started to really kind of think about this notion and thinking about how can I start to make a series of speculative dwellings that I'm resisting the use of metaphor. This was one thing I just like, there's too much metaphor in Indigenous architecture. Like this is a thing, right? Like, I don't know, the eagle is an important part of our culture. So I made a building that has eagle wings or something like that, right? Like, so I wasn't thinking about that. What I did was I looked at my tribe's lunar calendar, and we have names for each of the moons. This is true of most Indigenous cultures. So for instance, we have one that's called a maple syrup moon. That's when we gather maple syrup. It's part of our rituals. So these things are tied to things in the landscape. It might be about planting or hunting or gathering, resting, telling stories, all of those things. And so what I was intentionally doing is not making them metaphors of those things. They're all the same sort of form. They're all displaced from the ground. They all have a way that they meet the sky. They all have these antennae. I don't know why all of those things exist, and I'm not compelled to answer all of those questions. Do these antennae, are they there to communicate with each other, to communicate with other things? I'm not trying to make that sort of assertion. What I am trying to do, however, is to rethink the things that are the sort of elements of architecture. Can I rethink columns as legs, like the legs of a deer, right? So you can see in the drawing, there's a sort of, the deer leg is part of that. Is this an architecture that ran here? Is this an architecture that ran here and now is sweating and is holding itself still every time I look at it? I think that for me, this is a way of keeping myself nimble as a designer, right? And when I explain this to my students as well, I'm trying to keep them nimble, because like in athletic race or whatever you want to call it, competition, I need to be nimble, right? So I ran track when I was in high school. I'm also a cyclist, a competitive cyclist, right? So I don't go out and race a race every day. What my coach does, it gets me ready for the races that are coming up. I might have to do certain things to be good at that particular race, or the terrain or the timing or whatever it is. Then I'm ready to run it, right? So when I get the commission, I'm ready to run. I'm ready to go because I've practiced all of these sort of things. And so for me, as I gave myself basically this assignment, and I'm going to make 13 of these because there's 13 moons, but it did start to change the way that I was rendering as well, digital rendering. So I was making digital models along with the hand drawings. I originally made them so that I could cast the shadows on the elevations correctly. But then I started to think, we should be rendering differently, right? We should be like thinking about things not in this like eye level camera world, like it's always sort of human centric. What if I started to render from the wolf's eye point of view? What does the wolf see when it approaches this thing? And in this case, instead of columns, it's like hair or porcupine quills. I'm not deciding what that is, but what if it was just a bundle of stuff that's holding it up and the wolf is getting close to it? And what if the wolf can see things in the sky that I can't see as a human being? We know that birds can see things, right? Birds can see magnetism. It is the thing that they use to navigate and migrate with. But what if the wolf sees things that I don't understand? Have we ever asked the wolf what they see? But what if I can create a world where that exists? This happens in indigeneity, right? We often tell stories about things. And I like to use this example. If you've ever seen Reservation Dogs on Hulu, there's episode, I think it's episode 5, has a deer woman in it. And someone actually told me this story right before the episode came out. But it's a story about a very attractive woman that she attracts bad men, and those men end up going missing. And basically the gist of the story is, be nice to women, because there might be consequences to that. But in the story, the woman looks like a very attractive woman, but she has hooves like a deer. And so in the episode, the deer woman attracts a man, but when you see her get in the car, she has those hooves, right? And I just think that's just a brilliant way of documenting Indigenous storytelling and what it can be. It can have multiple things, right? A building can have hair. A rendering can have these things in the sky. I'm not always interested in like making this look like the right concrete and the right brick and the right carpet. And so when I teach representation to my students, I feel like if I can teach you the complexities of these things, that stuff is easy, getting the right color or the right sheen or whatever, because I'm kind of a rendering geek. But getting all of those right things is what I'm teaching students. And then how do you build worlds within what you're making? Like, how can you begin to think about the things that you're making as stories, right? How can you start to make those worlds? And so in this one, like the bear is rolling out the cloud to irrigate its own landscape. this one, the apparatus at the top is there to help me hear the first clap of thunder. It might happen while I'm sleeping, so that apparatus helps me do that. How can I make a sort of another world of things? And so this is the companion, the digital companion to the previous drawing. And each one of them are saying different things, right? I'm not always trying to say the same exact thing in every sort of representation. And so that is really important to me to be able to teach. I primarily teach representation. I teach it at the undergrad level, and then in studios, I teach about representation, drawing, model making, and rendering to my students. So the last thing I want to talk about is decolonization as a sort of idea or theme concept and how I think about it. So in its truest sense, decolonization is about land primarily and almost exclusively. And to truly decolonize, we have to give land back to the people that are indigenous in the United States and Canada. That's it, right? That's what it's about. But I do believe that there are other kinds of colonization. We know that there's settler colonialism. I think there's intellectual colonialism as well. And I don't think that we're always cognizant of those things. I don't think we're always cognizant of when we're part of that colonial system and when we're not. I see it as an apparatus. It's a machine. And I have to be a part of that machine to dismantle it. I have to be the Obi-Wan Kenobi that went into the Death Star and just turned the tractor beam off so that they could get out of the thing, right? This is what we have to do. I don't think it's enough to stand outside the thing and throw sticks at it or to create our own other world outside of it as Indigenous people. And as architects and architectural educators, that's why it's important for me to be in the academy, and it's why it's important to me to be the chair of a program. How can I begin to help like reassemble some of these pieces? Because I'm not one of these people that says, well, let's kind of throw the whole thing out and think about it again. And so the ways that these things are starting to manifest themselves in design for me, I have a lot of non-Indigenous clients asking me to make Indigenous things. And so Lawrence University is a private college in Wisconsin, asked me to make a physical land acknowledgement. They're starting to acknowledge the fact that the land that they're on is Menominee land. They changed the name of their plaza to a Menominee name. And so I made this piece that I call Otichea, which in Menominee means crane. It's one of their clans. And so one of the things that I looked at was the ways that they made patterns. Again, you can think of it as they're a reflection of nature. They make these very abstract sort of geometric things. And I think that's really sort of fascinating. Some other tribes make things that are curvilinear or very sort of organic and twiny, but others, and then others abstract things even more. But I would gravitate towards this sort of geometric patterning. So where Lawrence University is in Appleton, Wisconsin, and where the Menominee Nation is basically a kind of like 75-degree arrow or line that runs towards the nation. And so that actually reflects the land base of the Menominee, which was most of the state of Wisconsin. So Milwaukee, where I am now, is way down here. And Appleton, where the university is somewhere in the middle. So the piece is guided towards that, where the Menominee people actually are. And it's again, a physical thing. I think that, for me at least, architectural installations are very specific and they're distinct from art installations. For me as an architect, I want there to be a spatial agenda, a tectonic agenda, a material agenda. The things that buildings do, these things can do. And so we recently completed the thing. It was dedicated on Indigenous Peoples Day. It's made out of weathering steel. It has this custom perforation that reflects that patterning, the geometric patterning. One of the things I hadn't thought about when making this thing is that when you're standing in it, the pattern is reflected on you. The pattern is reflected into the space. The ways that light comes in is very specific, and the ways that people begin to experience it are very distinct. I made it out of the weathering steel because it's going to have a life, right? It's going to change over time, just like nature. It's a space that students can get into. It's in a sort of major place, and so people should be having those discussions about why this thing exists and whose land that they're on. And as a kind of acknowledgement, as a physical thing, that people should be having those discussions. And so when we think about colonialism and what it is, I borrowed these terms from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And she talks about the vocabulary of colonialism, right? So the first thing is the line, the map, the survey, or territory, right? To say the United States or 13 original colonies, Louisiana Purchase, all of these sort of things is usually the first thing, right? You make this thing and then you survey it. And that's part of the first step of colonization. The second is the center or the orientation to the system of power. They establish the capital. This is the center, right? Italians put churches in the middle of it. That is a very important sort of step, this idea of the center. The third is the outside, that the territory and people might be in oppositional relationship to the center, meaning we're inside, you're outside, build a wall, keep them out. Like all of that is part of colonization. And when I saw these terms, I started to really think like, we talk about these things in architecture all the time, right? Like we use these terms all the time. And so we should be thinking about when we're using them and how we're using them. When we're thinking about how to separate things, maybe things don't need to be as separate as we think they should be, right? I think that colonization feeds off of and is primarily fueled by a lack of empathy. Right? It is the one thing that keeps colonization going. It keeps the separation thing going. It keeps this us-them thing going. And as a design educator, I want to try to teach students how to be more empathetic, to begin to address issues they may not be completely comfortable with or they haven't before. I think in architecture school, we've been very good at teaching students about what and how, meaning like this museum like this, or this fire station like this library, this school, this is how you do it. But we haven't been teaching them the who and why. Why are we making this and who are we making this for? Who are we serving with this thing? Because we can, as educators, we can change that. We can still do the what and the how, and we can add the who and the why. Right, the why this particular project or why this community, and to also just not always teach it like a humanitarian effort or a thing, right? Like let's just talk about architecture and people. Let's talk about who isn't being served by whatever museum we're designing in studio. Let's talk about cultures. Let's talk about those things. And so a project that I have been working on, it's a sort of in-process research project. I started to look at the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of 1969 to June of 1971. I wrote a grant proposal that was funded for the project. And so it's been studied and studied. But the thing about the project that I think was most profound to me, at least, was that one, they decided to occupy the island based on a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the US government said, whatever land we deem a surplus, you can have. And this was a treaty with the Lakota people. Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison, was put into the federal land surplus, wasn't yet a national park. And so a group of students from San Francisco decided that they were going to take it. They actually convinced someone they paid a guy they said they wanted to take a tour of the island on a boat. They took the boat, they got about 3/4 of the way around, and they jumped off the boat into the water and got onto the island. The thing about why they took the island was what's most intriguing to me. They wanted to make a Native university, Native cultural center, Native ecological center. They wanted architecture. They wanted to make architecture. They didn't want it just for like political or economic gain. They wanted to make architecture. And so they created, there's a whole sort of system. You can see this is the ID system that they made. One of the things that's really important I think it's important in all kinds of resistances and sort of social movements is rhetoric, right? The idea that there's a thing that people can rally around, Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too, the idea that there is rhetoric. And on the Alcatraz Island, it's graffiti. This is one piece of graffiti. It's my favorite piece. It's in one of the buildings. Custer had it coming. The water tower has graffiti on it. Other things have graffiti on it. The graffiti that you see on the right is still there. So anywhere that referenced United States, they kind of crossed out and said, you're on United Indian property. Yeah, anything that said federal property, they turned the federal, they repainted over it and made it Indian, right? You're on Indian land. So this idea that the graffiti was a way of claiming the territory and beginning to think about the land in that way. I think those are acts of decolonization. And so as a designer, when I started to really examine this, I started to think, well, this is really complex. This is like, if I start to dig into this and all of the reasons why they had occupied it is very complex. So it made me start to draw differently. I started to draw differently because I wasn't trying to, again, approach the thing with a preconceived notion. I was trying to draw things in a way that I wanted to use different cognitive parts of my brain again. So I started drawing and I started to really think about, okay, I'm going to make a thematic drawing. This is a way of sort of like saying this is a very specific thing. So this one is about trajectories. And so the first thing I did was I drew all of the edges of all of the buildings off the map. And I started to think about trajectories of the sun, trajectories of wind, the boat traffic. I had maps of the boat traffic through the bay, aeronautical traffic, how airplanes cross the site. I started to look at like how the US was surveyed in big sort of geometrical sort of triangulations. Before they had GPS, they had to use these very large triangulations. That's on it. When I was there researching the thing, the America's Cup was happening in the San Francisco Bay. So I started to draw that in this. So this is how I learned to design as a student, was drawing on Mylar. And so this is what I decided I was going to do. I draw, these are what you're looking at is like 3 sheets of Mylar. I'm drawing on the front, I'm drawing on the back, I'm drawing with graphite, colored leads, I'm using stickers, I'm putting images on. And when I draw these, I'm not thinking about the big composition of the thing, other than the fact that the island is in the middle. I draw them as separate layers. I love drawing. I love making dotted lines. I love drafting. I love turning my pencil on Mylar, right? That is part of my ritual. That is part of the thing that makes me feel better. And so the drawing you're looking at, this probably takes me around like 6 weeks to draw the thing. I probably spend about 70% of my time looking for stuff. What am I going to put into the drawing? And people often ask me, like, how do I know when it's done? It tells me when it's done. Like when I put the last thing on and it just doesn't feel right, then I'm done with the thing. Like I'm kind of done with the drawing. But I also had to make these layers, and I wanted to think about how can I apply trajectories to indigeneity? And so I started to think about things like trajectories of death, meaning the Trail of Tears. If you could imagine the bottom here being where Florida is, and people were like physically marched to where Oklahoma was before it was a state. People were walked all that way. And it's really intended, 1, to get them off the land, but 2, to hope that they didn't make it. They hope that people couldn't make that journey. That's why they made it so extreme. Or looking at the trajectory my people took from New York State to the Great Lakes to Wisconsin in 1822, before Wisconsin was a state. Or the 4 Corners is on here because it's a sort of like crossing of 4 trajectories of 4 important mountains before there were state lines or those kinds of things a part of it. And this drawing is to territories. I'm thinking about how territories are claimed. I had all kinds of maps from the National Park Archive of vegetation, geology, plants, infrastructure, and I started to think about petroglyphs as ways of claiming territory or graffiti. And then I started to think about land secession, right? Land secession, secession is a fancy word for stolen. And so I looked at 2 states, just 2 specific states, the Great Lakota Nation, which is the big sort of boundary there, but then how each time the government came back and said, well, you can't have that, you can have this. And well, you can't have that, you can have this, until we got to the point where the yellow part is the federal reservation boundary. And my people in Wisconsin, the Oneida, when we arrived in Wisconsin in 1822, we purchased this much of the state. So the big gray part, we paid for that land. And then the federal government came in 1831 and said, well, you can't have that, you can have the smaller gray. We paid for that the second time. And then in 1838, they established the treaty, the boundary of the reservation, which is a small yellow rectangle. We paid for that. The third time we paid for that. And then Wisconsin became a state, 1848. The Dawes Act happened at the end of the 19th century, which allotted all the land. So we ended up with like 2% of that land. These are things that we should know. These are things that I think in design schools, architects, landscape architects, planners, we should all know that. This should be part of our curriculum. Because we're intervening in these landscapes, we should know what happened there, right? We should be starting every site analysis with indigenous history, not like when this place was founded as a city or when it became a state. No, how was this land used and utilized when people were here 15,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago? Those are the lessons to learn, not the small little blip on the big, long trajectory of the history. And so when I'm doing these kinds of drawings, I'm thinking about that, right? Like, how can I begin to think about those things? And so in the territories map, I'm also thinking about things like Acoma Pueblo. We're not talking about these as being the first cities in the US, or Cahokia, these large sort of establishments, right? We're not talking about the first multi-story buildings as being pueblos. We're not talking about things like Chaco Canyon being an important feat of masonry. We should be talking about that in our building technology courses, not just showing you what the Romans did, but what were these indigenous people making? Talking about the fact that this is more square footage than any Chicago skyscraper, right? We teach the skyscraper started in Chicago and the blah, blah, blah. No, the people were inhabiting large buildings way before that. And we should be talking about that. We should be changing the canon. And there's nothing stopping us from doing that, right? It used to be that we taught our history courses from textbooks, and whatever was in that textbook or survey of architectural history, that's what we did. Those days are over. So we should kind of stop doing that. There's a group that are 3D scanning petroglyphs in order to preserve them. So I put the petroglyphs in the drawing. And one of the important things that I index on the drawing down here, you can see 1229, 1890. And I had to figure out, how am I going to start to talk about the difficult parts of this history? How am I going to start to document that? Because it's part of the thing that made this group so angry that they needed to occupy the island. This is the massacre at Wounded Knee. More than 300 Lakota people were murdered, massacred on this day. More than 2/3 of those were women and children. The men were out in the fields fighting the US Army. What you're looking at, this is the United States Army. These men received medals for this. And this is where the people in that landscape, where their ancestors are. And so when the Dakota Access Pipeline is coming through, it's not just about contaminating the water, it's about the fact that people have ancestors buried in that landscape. Right? These are the things that we're not teaching and learning about. And I'm not placing blame or guilt or any of that stuff on this. I just said, like, let's just talk about the history. Let's just talk about the history. Let's just talk about the facts, and then allow people to decide what they want to do with those facts. So as a designer, I'm thinking about that, but I'm thinking in a sensitive way about, how am I going to show this, demonstrate this, so I don't put it in the drawing, I put the date in the drawing. But we need to be having these things. And the fact that, someone thought it was important enough to document with a photograph is really kind of disgusting as well. But we have to have these conversations. If we're going to approach anything towards reconciliation, we just have to be truthful with one another, right? And what are the things that we need to do to kind of go forward from there? And this is where I think we should be thinking about things when we're teaching young people, young designers, about how to be empathetic. Like, let's just think about, we all have different histories, right? I'm not claiming that anyone in this room got to architecture or design in the same way that I did, right? And you shouldn't make that assumption about me, right? It took me 6.5 years to finish my undergraduate degree. Well, I got into UVA and I got into 2 Ivy League schools. That didn't stop me. I'm not assuming that any one of my students or any one of my faculty or anyone is in the room or the place through the same sort of way. And we just have to be able to think about that. Or I'm not assuming that any one of my students has the same technology, or they have the same access or the same skills. we just have to figure out where can we sort of make these accommodations for each other and build that empathy. So the project is in this sort of stage where these are massing studies that I've done. And I'm really interested in making a building that is like an animal, like really like an animal, not just like in its coloration or materials, but how would it inhabit this island as if it were indigenous to this place. And so it's what I'm designing is the university for 1,491 indigenous students that would come to Alcatraz Island to learn about indigeneity in a sort of higher ed format. And that's the project. So these three themes: design as ceremony, drawing as medicine, and decolonization. For me, I start to think about these as a sort of foundation of a curriculum. How can I begin to teach these things? And I've been kind of teaching them in my studios and my other courses in various ways, but I don't always talk about it, meaning like I don't always like say, okay, kids, now let's gather around. Here's the indigenous lessons. My students know I'm indigenous. When I'm on a critique, I'm very clear about, well, in my culture, this is how I think about it. You might think about it this way too. But when I teach studios, I've only taught one indigenous studio, by the way. I've only really taught the studio I taught at Yale was about indigenous housing. Otherwise, I've been teaching studios in Latinx neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods. I've taught a studio about hip hop as a culture. And all of these are the same methodologies that I use. I use the same methodologies in whatever culture I'm examining, whether it's my own or others. What I'm trying to do is to take students into neighborhoods and communities that they don't normally go to and kind of teach them how to talk to people. How do I get information? How do I begin to think about the people that I'm making things for? So I'll leave you with this thought or concept of how I think about my own education. So this is the two-row wampum belt. It's a belt that signifies a treaty that was made between the Dutch and the Mohawk. The Dutch and the Mohawk realized that they're sort of competing for the same sort of trading areas in the Northeast, that they had to find a way to coexist. They agreed to basically to coexist, and they agreed on certain things. They made a treaty, the Dutch made a treaty in writing, all the Mohawk leaders signed it, but the Mohawk made this wampum belt as the thing that demonstrates that agreement. And it's called the two-row belt. And those two rows are their two canoes, the Dutch and the Mohawk, that run parallel. They're not in competition with one another. They're not encroaching on one another. They're respecting one another, right? That was the agreement. Didn't take long for that agreement to go out the window. But how I see this and interpret this is through my own education and my education my role as an educator, that my non-Indigenous education and my Indigenous life and history are these two parallel things. And many times I have to straddle these canoes as an educator, as an administrator, as a professional, and then as someone that's being Indigenous. If the waters get rough, I have to pick a canoe to get into. I can't straddle them both. Right? So sometimes it's the Indigenous canoe, sometimes it's the non-Indigenous canoe. But to understand that these things were ways of thinking about how Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people could coexist, this was always the goal. And I think it's the goal of us thinking about architectural education. Like these things can coexist with the education that we have been delivering in the ways that we have been talking about history. I love Corb, right? I'm not gonna apologize for that, but lessons in Corb, lessons in nature, lessons in what I know as an Indigenous person are the things that I'm trying to do. So these are the parallel tracks, right? When I'm looking at the Venturi Scott Brown and when I'm thinking about the duck and the decorated shed, I'm always trying to like, okay, this is what this equals to me in Indigenous culture. But I've had to make those things happen. And I think as educators, we can start to help deliver some of that to our students who are students of color that come from other cultures. Like how can we bring other cultures into ways that we're talking about architecture? Or how can we help students understand how those applications can work for them? Yabako, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to leave some time here for questions. I'll stand over here so I can take my mask off. So who else feels like they need to draw a little bit more? Right? I love this stay nimble. Stay nimble. This is going to carry me. So I'm going to hold the mic up and I'll walk around and take it around if we have questions. So go ahead and I'll come up and meet you. I have a question. I'll start here and then I'll come over there. You might be able to just yell it out.
Thank you, Chris. Great presentation. A little other perspective on viewing things. A lot of the art installations that you put together, when I look at it, I think about immediately. I'm thinking teepee, wigwam, in those installations. But you mentioned that you didn't want to define it too much. You wanted to kind of let it do its own thing. But I immediately go to dwelling when I look at those installations. And so I just wanted to see what your response is to that, just dwelling.
So you're right. So much so that you'll see the subtitle of this piece is "It's Not a Teepee," because I built this as a residency. So everyone that walked by was like, "What are you building, a teepee?" No, I wasn't building a teepee, but it's part of the trickster, right? And the trickster wants you to learn more about Indigenous architecture if that's the only example that you can come up with. So that's part of it. The other part of it is when people say those things, I don't necessarily think it's offensive as much as I think I'm on the right track. I'm making this thing is Indigenous, right? I'm doing the right thing here by making this thing. I'm trying to intentionally make you think about it though, in a way that is like, well, it reminds me of a teepee. Maybe I should have some responsibility to learn some other Indigenous architecture. So I just don't know teepee and wigwam. Those aren't, the second one's called, it's not a wigwam. But when I start to do that, that's what I'm thinking about. I think I must be on the right track because I'm doing a similar thing to what my ancestors had done or what other Indigenous people did in particular landscapes. I have made things that look too much like things. Like I have made experimental forms and using digital tools, and then I 3D printed it and I pulled it out and I'm like, this looks like a tomahawk. I put that one away, right? I just don't even want to have that conversation. So these things happen. We see certain things in the things that we understand, but in these cases, I'm intentionally trying to do that. Now, part of the reason this one looks like a teepee is I use teepee technology. Meaning when you make a teepee, and these poles that are in some of these teepees are huge, right? Above the ceiling. And usually and specifically I had a thesis student in Canada. I was on her thesis committee. She was teaching me how Cree people make teepees, and it's usually the women that make them. But I started to get fascinated by that, meaning that you take 3 of these giant poles and you loosely tie them together on the ground, and then you can take them and walk them up. And now you have the foundation for the thing. That's exactly how I made that thing. It's exactly how I made the second one when I was talking about dancing with the thing. That's how I made it. So it has a little bit of that teepee-ness to it, right? But again, I'm trying to allow the trickster to kind of trick you into thinking, well, is this teepee or not? How much of that can I have in there and it be a new thing as well? Yeah.
Thank you for coming in and speaking with us. I know you talked a lot about empathy, but I'm glad that you acted upon your own empathy and went one step further toward compassion, that is acting upon it to share with everyone here. Mm-hmm. So just want to thank you again for that. My question comes in the form of, how do you navigate the line between metaphor and not metaphor? Because you mentioned there's too much metaphor, but in the same instance, you're talking about these structures as animals. You talked about columns as legs.
Yeah. So that's a great question because it is something that I struggle with. And what I'm most interested in is what I'll call the structure of the metaphor. And I actually got really fascinated with this as a grad student. I wrote my thesis paper is like 80 pages, and most of it is about Roland Barthes. Because in my theory class, they were teaching us about Roland Barthes, and I was like, this is like about Indigenous symbolism. What is the sign? What is signified, and what is the signifier? Right? So I'm interested in that thing. But I've gotten a little bit more, I think, sophisticated about what that is, and it's indigenous ontology. And if you're interested in these topics, indigenous ontology, epistemology, axiology, Sean Wilson wrote a book called Research is Ceremony, and I use that, and I use it, have my students read it as well. But it's that indigenous ontology that creates that structure that made the metaphor, right? Like made the thing look, made the bear's ears look like, oh, those, I can see the bear's ears, right? So that's the thing. I'm interested in tapping into that structure. So here, if it kind of looks like a teepee, but it's not, I'm trying to, like, in some ways, I'm rearranging the structure so that you visually don't think it's the same thing. That's why in the drawing series, I'm intentionally making things, well, it kind of looks like legs, it kind of looks like hair, and I have an inspirational sort of image on one side. And sometimes I put it in the sketchbook, sometimes I don't. But I am cognizant of it being lost, like the turtle skull, right? The big metaphor, oh, it's a turtle, and then that's over. What I'm trying to do is, like, how can I make this a complex structure that's experiential, that about the materials, and I can think about being burrowed into the earth, and I can think about the sky, and I can think about my home or my grandmother. Like, all of those things are things that I'm trying to create, and to expand that metaphor into being more than one thing, because I feel like the Western sort of understanding of that is that Roland Barthes system, where it's a chart and you just plug the things in. But the indigenous system is one where it's a big set of reciprocities, and it can be multiple things, and multiple things can be true at once, right? There can be a woman that has feet like a deer. I don't not believe that that's true, which is a double negative, meaning I believe that it could be true, right? And just an aside with the deer woman, I was talking to Edgar Heapabirds, who's a indigenous artist, and I happened to be talking to him about something in my community that was similar, a story that's similar to the deer woman. In our community, it was a goat man. I told him about the story, and he told me about the deer woman, and then the reservation dogs episode just happened like a week or two later. But we were both fascinated by that thing. And that's what I'm kind of chasing with this thing, right? Like, it can be architecture or could be an animal's nest. How do I now translate that into a building? Can I translate that into a museum? Can I translate that into a health center? Can I translate that into a home? Yes, I'm interested in that, in doing that.
Excuse me, Chris, welcome. It's really great to see you, and I hope we're able to see you more often now that we'll be closer. The Loget image that you show at the end of your slide, or the end of the deck in the beginning, when that was shown to me for the first time, the story was a little different. The story was that when this architect was pointing towards the primitive hut, it was actually a moment where architecture and narrative came together, and building and storytelling were intertwined, because people gathered around a fire and they told their story. And so for me, it actually resonates a lot with what you've just described, your talk, and the idea that storytelling and building are the two things that all communities do. All cultures have always done those two things. And so I'm interested in the context that you work in, right? So the last image you showed with these two parallel canoes, I actually think there's more overlap than you're maybe giving credit.
Yeah.
I wonder for you, who are the people that you want to work with? Who are the people that you see as at your table? You know, who are the people that are doing similar things? You know, I think, you know, when I first saw your work, it was the moon houses, and I immediately thought of like Hayduk's masks, right? CJ Lim's recent work in London looks a lot like, or I wouldn't say looks a lot like, it has a kind of similar mapping quality as the work you're doing at Alcatraz. Neither are indigenous, right? Yeah. So are there people out there that maybe are not indigenous that are doing work that you find inspiring or valuable in some way?
Yeah. So I will say the sort of foundation for this way of thinking was given to me by my professors at UVA. Robin Dripps wrote a book, The First House, where she talks very specifically about this thing. And I was like, wow, this is indigenous, right? And then, you know, my professors, who were my thesis advisors, Peter Wellman and W.G. Clark, who couldn't be more different in some ways, because WG is like very building, like this, he makes beautiful buildings. He's unapologetic about making beautiful buildings. Peter Wallman is walking around talking in a language you can't really understand. It's almost like Shakespeare. And I was just like, this guy is amazing. Like, I feel like he taught me how to love the moon, and because he made a house for a surveyor, nomad, and lunatic. And then WG is like, I want to make beautiful buildings, right? And so those foundations for that were started because when I went to UVA, I didn't go there because there wasn't anyone indigenous, but what they did was they taught me how to think about my own culture, right? And they treated me as the expert in the culture in a way that I said, okay, this is what I want to do. My thesis project was a cultural center for my tribe, and I was thinking about how do I translate the creation story into that. And I see the parallels to Hayduck, and I'll just be honest, I'm not a Hayduck scholar. I don't know a lot about it, but I just love the work. And while I think that he was using parts of his own culture, but these sort of poems he was making and paintings he was making, I was really always fascinated by those. I never really could quite fully understand them, but I talk about his work, right? Yeah. And made me think of someone else that's similar to that it'll come to me in a second. But other peers or people that that are non-indigenous, people like Perry Culper, like he and I have this really great sort of online relationship. We have never physically met each other, but we send each other messages every once in a while, because you can certainly see his influence in my drawings. But what I was more interested in is this sort of language and the world that he's built. His drawings are the thing. For me, they're part of the ways of making architecture. And so I don't try to understand exactly what he's doing, but I respect it. And I respect this sort of like pushing representation in these weird sort of ways. So people like him, I really, and then there's another guy, Brian Cantley, we have a similar relationship to. We both sort of, we all have this sort of online thing going on, conversations about drawing. But yeah, and I did look at C.J. Lim's work. I loved his work, especially as a student when he published those first books about earth, water, and what was that? There's 3. Books, and then he made this other book, the How Green Is Your Garden, and I just thought that was fascinating too. And he's someone that he worked for Zaha Hadid, which is, as a student, I was fascinated by that. And then he worked for Zaha Hadid, and then he trained 2 people, Smoot and Allen, who also teach at the Bartlett School, and they're all people that I admire. I'm just like they're making worlds with their drawings, and that's what I'm trying to do too. So I talk about those things in my courses because I want to be able to teach students how to understand the work, right? Like that representation has an agenda, and what is that agenda, and what are the means by which you deploy that agenda through representation? There's someone else I'm slipping my mind, but I'm also interested in like other architects that are doing things. Like for me, in my position as an indigenous person, this is the sort of analogy I always use. I'm not saying that I'm the same, but I want to be the David Adjaye of indigeneity, right? The big museum that people make and identify with African Americans. I want that's my dream project. I want people to be, that's always been the goal. Every day I wake up, how can I do that? And then a person who became a friend of mine is Francis Carey, who is Berlin-based, but he's from Burkina Faso, Africa. I had the pleasure of teaching with him. He came to Milwaukee and we became friends. And what we realized was that our experiences were very similar. He has done an extraordinary job of making buildings in his community, of teaching his community how to make buildings, and he's not letting things stop him. Oh, the other influence is Sam Mockbee. Sam Mockbee, non-rural studio work is just amazing. And it does a similar thing. Like I always have this sort of impression of some of his houses that he made. It's like a werewolf that's in transformation, not quite a wolf and not quite a man, but it's a sort of weird thing. I think he found a way to do the things that I'm trying to do with buildings and drawings. Like how can we get those things to have a relationship with? Those are the people that I always kind of go back to. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Wanda. I actually had an opportunity to take Francis to dinner when bringing him out here to give a talk with Wanda, at which
He called me when he was out to dinner with you. I remember that now.
The lasting statement was when he said to Wanda, "My tribe is bigger than yours," which I thought was a weird flex. And by the way, Perry Culper is a really avid cyclist, so maybe when you guys meet, it can be on two wheels. So incredible lecture. Like any great lecture, there's like so many layers to unpack. I'm going to need to reflect and digest for quite some time. So my question is going to be, fairly superficial, but I thought it was really interesting. I had never seen your renderings before. Obviously, I've seen the incredible sketchbook drawings and seen the built installations, but hadn't seen the renderings. And I think you called yourself a render geek at one point. I had also not seen any of the film work, and thought it was really great as you were talking about the film of one of the Trickster projects as being a form of storytelling as well. And obviously storytelling and representation and how that might challenge one in the way that you think is a huge part of what you're talking about. So my question to you is about representation and how you might think about challenging yourself in terms of how much information you can convey and how you can challenge someone. I'm interested to know, have you thought about moving from renderings or testing the idea of essentially making films with the digital worlds that you're building to try to then layer in more? As you were talking about so many of your projects, you would describe these really vivid ideas of if I turn away, does it move? And then when I turn back to it, does it suddenly stand still? And the idea of sort of testing that, not to be literal, but to advance that as an idea is something I'm curious if you've experimented with that.
I haven't yet, and I am interested in it and have been thinking about it for a while. And so part of me is like, it depends on how I depict it, right? Like part of it can be a little bit of a shortcut. Like if I show you the thing moving, what's the payoff there, right? So I'm interested in people like David Lynch, who is like, that guy seems like, I don't know, he doesn't seem like interested in the narrative thing. Like narrative is a ball he just kicks around the room, and whether you get hit by it or not, that's okay. Like he's really just interested in the sort of images and music and how those things go together. This hasn't happened yet, but I'm interested in collaborating with people like Sky Hopinka, who's an indigenous filmmaker who I feel like has found this way to make films that are just like amazing. Like I feel like he's been able to do the things with film that I've been able to do with drawings, and to make these kinds of worlds, and including the music and the visuals, and not in a sort of like the narrative is in front of you. Like it's almost like he can make images melt and go into the sky in ways that are just like, it's better than what I could even describe, right? And so, yes, I'm interested in like, how can these things start to cross-fertilize one another, meaning the drawing, the rendering, the physical thing, the film of the thing. Can I start to tell the story differently? So in some ways, the Deer Woman thing is just like, it's almost like an illustration in a way, because it shows you the story, it shows you the hooves, it shows you the woman, but it doesn't really get into all of the sort of deeper things of like, what is out there? Am I seeing certain things? Because I believe, and that is true, that indigenous knowledge contains forms of knowledge that we haven't accepted in Western epistemologies, meaning dreams, visions, stories, hunches, feelings, senses are all valid forms of knowledge. And so whether the thing makes the hair on my neck stand up, and what is that sensation that it's giving me, or does it appear as not even as a literal shapeshifter, but I see it and it looks like a different thing to me. These things come from me early on, my own experiences as a child. So I feel like I got interested in architecture and these issues earlier than I even know. I used to have bad nightmares like as a child, and my grandmother came in my room one night and she like took a broom and she chased all the things out of my room. I didn't have nightmares after that. She believed me, you know what I mean? Like she believed that there were things that we couldn't see, and she took care of it. So as a designer, I'm really interested in that. we do that with visuals, sound, and get more even smells. Can I change the humidity in the space to make you feel sweaty? Right? Can I do that? I don't know yet, but I am really sort of interested and fascinated with trying to do that. Even with like exhibitions, right? Like I've started to be like, well, how can I do exhibitions differently to get some of that into it? Great question.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good.
My name is Richard Begay. I'm a Navajo architect. That fine-looking gentleman to my right is Aaron Sosi. He's also a Navajo architect. He was modest. He didn't introduce himself, but I just want to welcome you to the region. And I have seen a couple of your teachings and presentations, and I've always been very intrigued and fascinated with just the perspective that you share, and like again, kind of picking up on the multimedia about how I think in one of your classes you had one of the students do as though they were the gaming or multimedia.
Yep.
To look at it from a non-indigenous or a non-human perspective, but more from an animal perspective to kind of get that, to try to have and get these clues to see if we can take from that to allow us to think differently about the world we live in and how those contributions can inform us on design.
Yeah.
So I just want to say I saw that. I was quite fascinated by that. I want to welcome you here. I want to ask you, could you share a little bit about your upbringing as a young child? You talked about the res. I came from the Navajo res. It was my wife, Carmen. We grew up, but share a little bit of that. I'm kind of curious about that.
Sure. I grew up in HUD housing. Our reservation, well, what we were told is like it had 40% unemployment. At times, 100% of my parents were unemployed. This was pre-gaming, so there wasn't any revenue on the reservation, right? Like this was like a no man's land. It was crazy. So becoming an architect and going to college was not a thing. Like no one did that. Everyone was like, how are you going to do that? But I feel like that experience has guided me and gotten me to the points where I am right now. And again, so I don't assume that anyone got to the point that they are in the same way. I feel like I got here in the non-standard way. So I'm working on an exhibition right now for Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. And they asked me, as one of 5 designers, were examining the house. It's just a house. And so they let us do whatever we kind of want with it. So I said, I wanted to address indigenous housing. Right. And so this is, I would say, largely guided by my own experience of growing up in a HUD house. And so for me, the theme is my HUD house didn't have this. My HUD house didn't have a garage. My HUD house didn't have a sidewalk. My HUD house didn't have a place for me to study, didn't have a view of the sky, didn't have a place for a fire. So I'm trying to make a house that has all of those things, because what I started to realize over time was the house that I grew up in is the same, almost literally the same house in Canada, in Arizona, in South Dakota. It's the same house. It's the same floor plan. It's the same 412 pitch roof. And what the community, the Cree community in Manitoba told me, like, whatever you do, don't make that thing. Like, we hate that thing. We hate that 412 gabled ranch looking thing. And so I'm trying to make the opposite of that thing. Like, I'm trying to make this shape-shifting thing that's somewhere between a house and an installation. And that's going to be built and installed in next year. But that experience of me growing up in that thing, I think had more to do with me becoming an architect than I know, because I would realize, well, our houses aren't lined up. We don't have sidewalks. We used to play baseball in we had a front yard, and our neighbors had a yard, and there was a street in between. Like, we played baseball between 2 houses. I don't know how we never broke a window, but we didn't. But my point is, like, we figured out how to make community, but despite the architecture that wasn't serving us, right? The architecture where I had to sit in my bedroom and draw floor plans to become a good architect. That's what I had to do because I didn't have anywhere to study. Like, how was I going to be a good student if I didn't have anywhere to study in this tiny bedroom that can only fit a twin bed, right? Like, that's not going to work. And it doesn't work for Indigenous people, right? Having a home is great, but if we don't have a cultural connection to these homes, there's never going to serve us, right? This housing needs are never going to be filled, and we should be addressing the design of them. There are people looking at policy and economics, probably not, they should be doing it better, but there's no one looking at the design of the thing. Like, how do we begin to do that? All of those things fueled me. And like, even as a young person, we lived 9 miles from my high school. So I either had to ride the bus for a long time, or usually I got on my bike and rode it. I rode like 7 miles to my friend's house, or I rode 9 miles to where all my friends were. You know, nothing was easy. Nothing was easy. And so like one of the students asked me in my interview at UNM, like he was like, I think he was trying to trap me, but he said, well, why do you want to do this job? You know, the chair has to answer all the problems and take care of all the issues. And I was like, nothing has been easy for me in my life. So this is going to be a treat. And even like going through the tenure process, I said to one of the professors that came out of a faculty meeting, like, Chris, this is really hard. Like, I'm sorry that this is taking so long, or whatever, this and that and the other. And I said, look, man, I grew up without food. I grew up without a hot meal every day. This is nothing. This is nothing. I can deal with this bureaucracy, but that formed who I am. And the person that I am, like architecture professor Chris, there's a different thing inside, right? And again, I don't assume that everyone else presents the same thing that they were, but and I've learned over time how much of that I want to share, you know, because the other thing I haven't talked about, the two canoes is an issue, meaning as a designer academic, we don't examine our own culture, right? We don't always do that. We're just in the culture. And so it's a difficult thing to do. It really is. And I don't pretend that it's not. You know, the histories and stories and things that we all, as Indigenous people, are carrying around, the world needs to know, right? The world needs to know that my grandmother was beaten for speaking her language in a boarding school. And that's why she wouldn't teach me the language, right? That's just something I was like, this has been part of my existence, but as a person that has a platform now, I feel like it's part of my responsibility to do that. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm part of the Wolf Clan. In Oneida, the Wolves are the pathfinders. And so I'm trying to carve that path for other Indigenous people behind me. And some of those people are my friends and colleagues, students. I want to be able to get more Indigenous people into architecture and even landscape architecture. I don't know any Indigenous landscape architects. It might be my fault, but I don't know of any. And I want to try to help that happen too. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. I have a question for you. So over the last couple of years, Jason Shupak was the last leader here, and he wanted to redesign the design school. And unfortunately, he had to go back and take care of his parents in another part of the US. And so he left. So this is a question for you. Now that you're coming in to UNM, and I'm guessing you get a little bit of a chance to redesign a design school. What are your plans? What do you think are your mission, and what will you focus on to redesign? And I'm guessing that UNM is as diverse as ASU. We have a lot of diversity here. And I love, by the way, what you said, that our methods for being inclusive can apply to many other cultures. So there's a question for you.
I am going to try to take what we have been good at in teaching architecture and leverage it into other things in how we examine things. So for instance, if I'm teaching a representation course, I'm just teaching students how to render things, draw things, make things. The things that they render and draw that's up for grabs. If I'm going to use, for instance, at UNM, if I'm going to use a border town or the issues of living adjacent to the border as the issue I want to represent, okay, let's do that. Let's do that in our building technology courses. Let's do it in our history courses. Let's do it in our representation, our theory, everywhere. And I'm not going to ask any of my faculty to teach anything they don't want to teach. I'm just going to ask my faculty, what do you teach? How are you teaching it? How can I help you make it better? And how can I help my assistant professors? How can I get you to the place that you need to be to gain tenure? And then how can I help support my senior faculty who are trying to accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish? Because all of it is about empathy, right? It's about understanding. And so academia can be this machine that is it has been trying to push people through the same sort of thing. And I feel like a little bit we're seeing some of the resistance of that, meaning enrollments are starting to go down across the country. Part of that is demographic, but I think part of it is like saying, well, what is really the value of higher education? Can I start to show students of any white, non-white, color, whatever you want, whatever term you want to use, just students, how can you see yourselves in making a better world? And especially as designers, how can we design a better world? And how can we use the tools that we have been using in a better way, right? Someone said to me once, like, there's the saying that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I don't know that that's completely true, because the master has taught me how to make the tools. Now I'm over here I'm reconfiguring the tools that are going to dismantle the house or rearrange it. Let's put the door in the right place and make it big enough for people to come through. And for me, as a chair and as someone that's trying to get Indigenous people into the discipline, I don't pretend to be like, okay, I'm going to hold up a sign and say, scholarships, everyone come in. I have to go into those communities. I have to go to every tribal community college and say, look, this is what architecture is. This is what I'm doing. If you're interested in it, come talk to me about it, right? How can we begin to do those things? I think we all have the tools to do it. We just have to take the initiative to do it. Yeah.
Maybe one last question, and then we can break. But I started to think about titles for studios, the architecture of reciprocity, right? The architecture of, there were so many words that you've used that could be food for what?
Yeah.
My question is, what are you hearing from your students and, the younger generation of where they see architecture going? Because I know we have people and mentors and people above us teaching, but what does the next generation, what are you hearing that they say they would like it to go, or what they're interested in?
I think my impression is that students are almost demanding to see other things than the things that they've been seeing. Students understand that there is a kind of reckoning that needs to happen within higher education. I think the harder part of all of this, and I think it's a thing that's and it's this capitalist system, but student debt is really a crime. People are benefiting from your being here in ways that is never going to impact you, right? And in ways that is really cumbersome for students. So how can we change that? I don't really know, but can we hack the system in order to help other students get the educations that they need? Those are really big things. That's the kind of things that I'm hearing. Even for like people that recently graduated, like I had a woman working for me who was a student. She recently graduated, and then she's like, Chris, I actually need to make more money because her student loan payment is probably more than my mortgage payment, right? Like, it's crazy. And I was like, this is a crime. But how can we do that? What can we do about that? I'm not 100% sure, but we have to be able to, I think some of the answer is let's stop being our own institutions and let's start to be consortiums of thought people, right? Like, can we start to make the Indigenous consortium in the Southwest, right? That's the way to do it. And in Canada, all of the three of us that are tenured architecture faculty who've been talking about this for a while. But my point is, I feel like this is what I hear from students. And students of color come to me and I realize that there are structures within the institutions that don't serve them in ways that they should be served. Meaning, me as a faculty of color, if a colleague says something to me, I have a voice, I can speak back. But a student is probably just going to walk away and never come back. And that's a crime. That's really not right. How can we make mechanisms for students where they can have a voice and you can learn at the same time, right? I also think that it is also part of the way that I think too. Is technology is important. Technology is not antithetical to indigeneity, right? So like Richard saw my Yale, and I think Wanda saw my Yale student who did a gaming platform, and I said, look, make this how the wolf sees the world, how the muskrat, and how the deer. And he made a whole sort of in the gaming edge, and he made this thing. And I feel like, okay, this is a way to get young Indigenous people interested in this, because we're just telling stories, right? And if those stories are in this sort of gaming world, let's do it, right? Let's make the architecture inside these things, because it's really what we're doing. Like, let's make this experiential. And I see technology as almost like the spirituality. It's like an immaterial thing that's in our world, and how do we start to make it? And that's kind of how I make some of these forms. I don't talk about a lot of the like technology, grasshopper, rhino stuff that I use, but I do, and I see that. So the point is, like, how can we talk to young people in that sort of realm as faculty members? Like, I use the technology and I'm teaching the technology, so I'm trying to always. It's my obligation as an educator to stay up to date with what is happening in the discipline. Yeah, like. Those are I think the primary things that students are asking for, and I'm trying to deliver.
Great answers, great questions, everyone. I cannot tell you how excited I am for you to be with us in the Southwest. I feel like the more of us that get together, the more the ideas grow. And I wanted to leave you a thank you note. This is our study of Arizona from an Indigenous perspective. We did it for a campus study here at ASU. President Crow keeps picking designs out of here that he wants to purchase. So I give this to you as a thank you for joining us.
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. Thank you for braving COVID, putting your masks on, and joining us for a live outing. Thank you. You're welcome.